Okay, strap yourselves in for this one because today we are diving into a report that's sending ripples through, well, pretty much every field.
Yeah, it's causing a stir, that's for sure.
It argues that superintelligence, and I mean the kind that could completely transform our world, might be a lot closer than we think.
Closer than we think. Yeah, we're talking 2030 here. Less than a decade away.
Which feels like tomorrow, practically.
It does, it does.
So, not exactly light reading for a Tuesday afternoon, but what makes this report so captivating, at least for me, is that it's not just some, sci-fi fantasy.
Right.
This is a meticulously crafted roadmap, and it comes from someone who's been in the trenches of AI development. Leopold Aschenbrenner, former OpenAI researcher.
And he lays it all out in his report, Situational Awareness, the Decade Ahead.
A very fitting title, I might add. And he doesn't sugarcoat things, does he? He's basically saying that AI is advancing at a pace that most people, even those of us who follow this stuff closely, are drastically underestimating.
Yeah, he's really blowing the lid off of some of the timelines that people have been working with.
Yeah.
And he's saying we could be hitting this major milestone, artificial general intelligence, AGI, by 2027.
2027, that's what, 3 years from now?
3 years.
Okay. Now, for our listeners who maybe haven't encountered that term before, AGI, it's not just our smartphones getting a bit more intuitive.
No, no.
It's not just, our social media feeds being able to predict exactly what kind of cat video to show us.
Right, exactly.
This is about AI reaching a level where it can basically tackle any intellectual task that a human can, and probably many that we can't even conceive of.
It really throws the doors wide open. It's a total game changer.
So we're talking about AI scientists, AI artists, AI everything.
Everything, yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting because the report goes even further, suggesting that we could see a really rapid transition from AGI to what's called superintelligence. We could be talking within a year.
A year.
Yeah.
Okay, so to put that into perspective for our listeners, that's like going from learning your ABCs to writing a symphony overnight.
Yeah, it kind of boggles the mind.
So what's driving such an unbelievably fast timeline? What's fueling this kind of explosion in capability?
Well, that's where Aschenbrenner's methodology comes in. He uses a method he calls counting the ohms, which stands for orders of magnitude,
Yeah.
to kind of chart this trajectory
What's
out.
OEMs? Okay.
And essentially what he's doing is he's looking at historical data, things like computing power, algorithmic efficiency, how quickly AI is learning, and then he extrapolates those trends forward.
Okay, so kind of like if we were to plot the growth of, say, internet speeds over the past few decades, and we use that to get a sense of where we might be in a few years, only we're talking about something exponentially more complex.
Exactly, and far more powerful. And what's fascinating is that the results of this kind of analysis are pretty mind-blowing. For example, he highlights this thing called the math benchmark.
Okay, the math benchmark, and what does that measure?
So this measures an AI's ability to solve difficult high school math competition problems.
Okay, so high-level problem solving. Got it.
And just 2 years ago, the very best AI systems, they were at a 5% success rate.
Okay, so failing pretty miserably, basically.
Pretty much. Today, they're at over 90%.
It's like AI went from needing a tutor to being the tutor practically overnight.
Right. It's incredible how quickly it can happen, these big leaps. And what's important to keep in mind here is that this report isn't just about AI getting better at the things it can already do,
Yeah.
It's suggesting we're on the verge of unlocking entirely new levels of AI capability.
Unlocking is a very deliberate word choice, I would say.
Absolutely. The report actually delves into this concept of unhobbling AI. So basically, removing limitations that we've built in. Right now, you have constraints like short context windows, meaning the AI can only process so much information at once.
Right.
Or it lacks access to the vast array of tools that we humans use every day.
So it's like we're asking it to write a novel on a sticky note versus giving it a computer and access to a whole library.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Aschenbrenner argues that by removing these limitations, by unhobbling AI, we'll unleash its true potential.
Which is a little bit exciting and a little bit, should we be doing that?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
I mean, it makes sense though, right? If we're talking about AI advancing at this pace, reaching these incredible new levels of capability, that's going to come with some pretty hefty requirements on our end.
Oh, absolutely. This kind of rapid advancement, it doesn't come cheap. And Aschenbrenner, he's very upfront about that in the report. He actually dedicates a whole section to what he calls the trillion-dollar cluster.
Trillion with a T. Okay, so we're not talking about just like upgrading our laptops here. What does that even mean in terms of actual resources?
Well, for starters, it means we're talking about an unprecedented level of investment in computing power. Aschenbrenner, he estimates that by 2028, individual AI training clusters, these are essentially massive supercomputers that are dedicated to AI, those could cost hundreds of billions of dollars each.
Hundreds of billions each.
Each. To give you some context, that's more than we spent to build the International Space Station.
Okay, so forget a room full of servers. We're talking about like building dedicated power plants just to keep these AI brains running.
You're not wrong to think that.
Yeah.
Aschenbrenner actually cites one estimate that suggests by the end of the decade, we might need to increase U.S. electricity production by 10% just to meet the demands of AI.
Yeah, wow.
And that's just the energy consumption side of the equation. We also have to think about all the resources that go into building and maintaining these systems.
Okay, so let's say we figure out the computing power, right? We develop these incredibly advanced algorithms and we unhobbled AI, like we were talking about
Right.
before, giving it access to potentially unlimited information, all these tools. Then what?
Right.
How do we even begin to make sure that this incredibly powerful technology, something that can essentially think for itself, how do we make sure it doesn't end up being misused
Yeah.
or even, becoming dangerous?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
That is the million-dollar question. And to Aschenbrenner's credit, he doesn't shy away from it in the report at all. In fact, he argues that one of the most pressing issues we're facing right now is the security challenge. Because this technology is evolving so rapidly that, frankly, the security measures that are in place at many of the leading AI labs, they're lagging behind. It leaves them vulnerable to breaches, sabotage, you name it.
Okay, hold on a second. So we're talking about the potential for, like, bad actors getting their hands on essentially the blueprints for superintelligence. That's a pretty chilling thought.
It is. And Aschenbrenner, he doesn't mince words here. He argues that protecting these advanced AI systems requires a level of effort and coordination on par with, get this, the Manhattan Project.
Wow. Okay, so that's a comparison that really makes you stop and think. We're talking about a national security issue on the scale of developing the atomic bomb. This is clearly not something to be taken lightly.
Absolutely not. And that actually brings us to, I think, the crux of the issue here. Superintelligence, and what it really means for the future of humanity. We're not just talking about a new gadget here. We're not even talking about a new industry. We're talking about potentially creating something that could fundamentally reshape our world. And whether that's for better or worse, well, that remains to be seen.
Right. It's a lot of power to wield, to put it mildly. And honestly, it makes you wonder, even if we can control this technology, even if we could, should we?
That is the question that keeps ethicists and philosophers up at night. And it's something that Aschenbrenner grapples with in the report, too. He digs into this whole concept of superalignment, which boils down to this. How do we ensure that superintelligent AI, something that could eventually outthink us in every way, how do we make sure it remains aligned with human values, with human goals?
It's a question that almost feels impossible to answer. How do you program something to understand, let alone uphold, values that we, as humans, we've been debating for centuries and still haven't quite figured out ourselves?
It's a monumental challenge. And Aschenbrenner, he argues that it's going to require a fundamental shift in our thinking. He suggests that these more traditional approaches to AI safety, things like trying to anticipate and hard code every possible scenario, basically trying to write a rule book for superintelligence.
Right, like it's some kind of unruly teenager?
Exactly. He's saying that's probably not going to be effective, not when you're dealing with something as complex and as potentially unpredictable as a superintelligence.
So if simply programming and rules and constraints isn't going to cut it, what does Aschenbrenner propose we do? How do we even begin to approach a problem of this magnitude? It really does feel like we're venturing into uncharted territory here, like we're talking about technology that has the potential to, well, outthink us in every conceivable way. So how do we even begin to steer something like that in a direction that's actually beneficial for humanity?
Well, Aschenbrenner, he argues that it's not just about controlling superintelligence. It's about guiding its development. And it's about doing that in a way that aligns with our values from the get-go, from the very beginning.
So we're not talking about like putting up guardrails after the fact. We're talking about baking in these values from the ground up.
Exactly. And he suggests that we need to make a pretty fundamental shift here. We need to stop thinking of AI as just another tool, another instrument.
Right.
And we need to start recognizing it as a potential partner, something that we need to be collaborating with, not just controlling.
Collaboration implies a certain level of trust, though.
It does.
Which is a big ask, I think, for a lot of people when you're talking about something as potentially powerful as superintelligence.
Oh, absolutely. And Aschenbrenner acknowledges that. He's not saying we should just blindly trust AI, right? But he is saying that we need to create a framework for collaboration. And it needs to be based on shared values, shared goals. So this is going to require a really multifaceted approach involving not just researchers, but policymakers, ethicists, even the public. We need to be having these conversations now while AI is still in these relatively early stages of development to make sure that our values are, as I said, embedded at its core.
This sounds like a really monumental task, though.
It is.
I mean, this isn't just about, like, going in and tweaking a few lines of code here and there.
No, it's much bigger than that.
Yeah.
Aschenbrenner is essentially calling for a global effort to rethink our relationship with technology as a whole, something that he believes, and I'm inclined to agree with him, is absolutely critical as we move into this era of superintelligence.
And this is where I think things get really interesting because he lays out a pretty radical, some might even say audacious, proposal for how we might begin to accomplish all of this. And that's where the project comes in.
Right, right. So Aschenbrenner's argument is that given the sheer scale of what we're talking about here, the urgency, the potential risks, that a government-led initiative, something similar in scope and ambition to the Manhattan Project, is not just a good idea, it's necessary. It's inevitable. He envisions this dedicated team bringing together the best minds across disciplines, researchers, policymakers, ethicists, you name it, all working together. And they've got the resources, they've got the authority to actually steer this whole thing, to guide the development of superintelligence in a safe and beneficial direction.
Okay. It's a bold vision, and it definitely raises a lot of questions, right? I mean, can something this massive, this ambitious, really succeed? And who gets to decide what these shared values, these shared goals really are? Those are some pretty heavy questions that I think we as a society are going to have to grapple with.
Absolutely. And to be fair, Aschenbrenner doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he really stresses that the most important thing right now is to start having these conversations. We need to do it now before it's too late. He's very clear that he sees this next decade as being potentially the most consequential in human history. What we do in the next 10 years, the choices we make, they will determine not just the future of AI, but the future of humanity itself.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure. I mean, we're talking about a potential turning point for civilization. And it's both, I don't know, exhilarating and more than a little terrifying all at the same time.
I think that's a very fair way to put it. And that's really what makes Aschenbrenner's report so compelling. It's both a wake-up call and a call to action, right? He's not trying to scare people. He's trying to make us aware. He's trying to make us aware of the incredible potential here, but also the very real risks that we're facing. And ultimately, he's saying that we have a responsibility to engage with this. We have a responsibility to educate ourselves and to take part in shaping the future that we want to see.
So, to be clear, this isn't just about some abstract technological advancement happening in a lab somewhere. This is about all of us. And the choices that we make today, they're going to have ripple effects for generations to come.
Without a doubt. This isn't just a conversation for the scientists and the policymakers anymore. This is a conversation that everyone needs to be a part of. Because the future of AI, it's the future of humanity. And it's up to all of us to decide what that future is going to look like.
This deep dive into Aschenbrenner's report has been, I think it's safe to say, eye-opening, to say the least. We've covered a lot of ground here today. From this idea that AI is advancing much, much faster than most people realize, to the very real potential for superintelligence emerging within our lifetimes, to the absolutely critical importance of security and ethics and global cooperation. And I think one of the key takeaways here is that, we are without a doubt on the cusp of something truly, truly extraordinary, but it's up to us to make sure that this technological revolution leads us to a brighter future, not a dystopian one.
I completely agree.
So as you continue to learn about AI, and I know our listeners are the kind of folks who like to stay ahead of the curve, remember this: you have a voice in this conversation. Engage with these ideas, ask the tough questions, and help us shape the future that we all want to see.